Hello everyone, my name is Paul Third, and this week I want to share with you arguably the best piece of advice that I've been given by one of my mentors in the industry. This episode is going to be talking about low end and the importance of a very fundamental part of low end that if you do not get right, you are one, not going to be able to get your mixes super loud, and two, your mid-range, your instruments, your vocals, your pianos, your synths, they are always going to fight against the bass. Sometimes the kick, but if you don't get this right in the bass, it's genuinely going to drown everything else out, and you're just always going to be fighting.
But what is it, Paul? Just tell us. Stop the waffling. Get to it.
This week we are going to be talking about the importance of managing the sustain of your low end and how that impacts your entire mix. If you do not get the sustain of your low end right, you will be firefighting throughout the entire mix to get everything else to sit with it. Now, when we think about low end, the most important thing that you need to think about is the way that acoustic sound works. I'll leave a video here because I've got I did a full geek out on it. But long story short, all you need to know is that when it comes to acoustic sound, and not the way that we hear it, but the way that acoustic sound actually is received by processors, compressors, EQs, blah, blah, blah. The way that acoustic sound works is that the highest energy is in the low end, and then it tapers down to the mids and the highs. Now, knowing that low end has more energy compared to mid frequencies and high frequencies, what that tells you is that if you've got too much low end in your mix, it's going to drown out everything else because the mid-range and the high end doesn't have the energy to be able to poke through the low end. Now, what's a way of fixing that? Well, the way of fixing that would be to shorten the wavelength of your bass, or it could be your kick. So if you've got a really boomy kick, it's like boom, boom, boom. Shorten the wavelength. When I spoke to bass session players in the industry, they were telling me all about, I was asking them questions, and they were telling me that they always think about the attack and the sustain of the bass in terms of the feel. And they were saying to me that there'll be times where if the instrumentation or the production is quite stripped back and there's not a lot going on and there's space, and it's I'll let the bass ring out, I'll let the sustain kind of ring out a little bit, and I'll try and control that as much as possible. But when the production is really busy and there's a lot of instruments going on, then I'll tighten that up, and I'll tighten that up with my playing, and I don't know, I don't want to say if they go staccato, but again, they are able to play with feel and know how to sit in the pocket, and when the track needs to be filled out, and when the bass just needs to sit in the pocket and be an extension, almost like a lower octave of the instrumentation.
Paul, that's all fucking fine and well. Tell me how to do it.
Right, okay, fair enough. Right, okay, I'll fucking hold your hand for you. Now, if you want to reduce the sustain of a kick or bass, any low-end instrument, a really good tool is Kickshaper by Emre Çelik. Well, it's WA Productions, but my good friend and mentor, Emre Çelik, who actually was the one that told me about this technique. I use his deboom knob because it's just so simple. I just sit with the low end, I listen, and when it comes to the bass, I just take deboom and I shorten the wavelength until I feel like the sustain is almost kind of in time with the track, and it's working, and I'll take the drums out and I'll listen to the instrumentation, and I want the low end to sound like it's just like a lower octave of the instruments, and I'll know straight away if I take the drums out and I listen to just the mid-range, what I'm going to hear is that if the bass is too much, it's going to drown everything else out, and level-wise it's going to be louder than the instrumentation and the vocals. Now, for anybody saying, well, I don't want to buy this £17 plugin or how much ever it is. If you've got a transient designer with attack and sustain, like an SPL transient designer, you'll be able to do the same thing. It's just that Emre does it. Emre's does it better. I'll leave a link to the review here with Emre going through everything that he coded and blah blah blah. He's a very, very clever man, and he found a way of basically doing it a better way. And this is something that I'm going to be able to kind of show you a very good example of, because I was doing recalls for an album that I mixed last year. It's a very, very, very long story, right? But when I did the first 2 tracks, I had intentionally like shortened the wavelength of the bass and managed the sustain so it sat kind of in the pocket of the entire context of the mix. And I did that on the first 2 tracks. What I did on the third mix was, because these were like sessions from a long time ago, I was trying to remember all the stuff that I do now and change certain things. Like, it wasn't really a revision, it was more like a remix. And that's what I'm having to do fucking the rest of them now. Because I want them to sound as best as they can for the client. Which means I need to fucking remix them. I know it's my choice. But, right, what I did was I forgot about Kickshaper on the bass. And I got to the end of the mix and, you know, I finished it. Again, it was in an afternoon. You know what it could be like when you just like, no references, just like fucking crack it out, right? Okay, let's get it done. And I sent it to the client without listening to the other 2 mixes that I'd done. And straight away when I listened to them, I was like, that doesn't sound right. Like, why do the other 2 sound better? The mid-range is more forward and it just doesn't sound as tight. And what I realised when I listened more closely was that the low end was just too much and it was kind of out of control and it was drowning out the mix. And due to the fact that when a bass sustains, it sustains like consistently at the same level, what that means is that when I get to the bus compressor, I use like a diode bridge from HRK, and then it gets to the limiter. If you're not utilising a high-pass filter in the sidechain in the compressor, what's going to happen is that low end is just triggering that compression. But as much as I'd like clipped everything, because the bass had so much sustain in it, it was just overkill. And because of the energy that it has, it was just drowning out everything. And it was affecting the compression, it was affecting the clipping, the limiting, it was affecting everything. But as soon as I tightened it, I was like, wow, that's it. There you go. There, my mid-range is here. Nothing's fighting anymore. Everything's more detailed and clearer.
Paul, all that fucking waffle. Let me hear it, right? Let me fucking hear it.
So first off, let's listen to a more stripped back part of the song where, in hindsight and on a reflection, I don't want to reflect too much on it. I don't know if I maybe should have automated the deboom knob and maybe added in a little bit more sustain in this bit, because I actually think that while the bass is still a little bit too much in that first mix, I do think because the mix is quite sparse at that point, the bass has enough space to fill out. So I think a middle ground would have worked here, but you'll hear the difference between like a bass with lots of sustain and then a bass really, really tight.
Shade in the flame from furious vandal, fading from shame, I'm knocked to the floor, stuck to the floor. Shade in the flame from furious vandal, fading from shame, I'm knocked to the floor.
Right, but what about when the track starts to become a little bit more busier, right? And we have more instrumentation coming in. We've got backing vocals and we've got electric guitars coming in. We've got more mid-range coming in, trying to take up space in the mix. Now, this is where it's really prominent. Just listen to how the vocal, and especially that electric guitar, it just can't get through that sustain of the bass. And listen to how much tighter the bass is and the low end is tighter. You might feel that, oh no, I've lost bass. You kind of have lost bass because it's not as long. But, you know, the tonality of the bass is still there. You know what I mean? I've not added it. I've not EQ'd anything differently. I've not compressed or clipped anything differently. I've just shortened the wavelength of the bass. Now, just listen to this difference. It should, in my opinion, it's night and day because you'll hear it. Right, just listen to it.
Light up the way with a two-ended candle. Night will be day when I knock down the door. Frighten away the shivering shadows. Double the ray, I must go see more.
Now, to me, that should have been pretty oblivious, right? Now, if that wasn't enough, I'll show you the next part of the song, because it's the bit where I hear it the most, where the bass is completely drowning out the acoustic guitars. Now, I had the electric guitar pretty loud at that section. Now, there's this section afterwards where it's got 3 acoustic guitars, and it's kind of got like a picked acoustic guitar, and I didn't want it too loud in the mix, but I wanted it just enough so it was heard. And I was fighting, firefighting, trying to get this acoustic guitar to sit right. And as soon as I just shortened that wavelength, everything opened up. This to me is like the most obvious example that I think you could have on how the sustain really does mask the lower mid-range. You can't really hear the kind of fundamental of the strums of the acoustic guitars, and that picked acoustic guitar is really fighting. And the thing is, the more level that you added to it, it ended up, the dynamics of it just kind of started making it sound louder, and then I'm like, oh, maybe I should compress it, and then when you compress it, everything starts to sound smaller, where all I had to do was shorten the wavelength of the bass. Let's hear it.
Years go, fading so low, never to try and never to know. The light burning in me, I'll be the candle melting away with such greed. The years go, fading so low, never to try and never to know. The light burning in me, I'll be the candle melting away with such greed.
Now, I did have kick shaper on the kick in the first mix, but I wasn't taking the sustain out as much. I was taking the sustain out a little bit. I think I had it in default setting. But when I was listening to it again, I was like, maybe the kick is maybe just a little bit too puffy. And I just like, no, let's make it a little bit tighter. So I made that a little bit tighter as well. And when you do that, all of a sudden, everything's got more space. And because you've basically controlled the energy of your low end, because the longer your kick is, the longer your bass is, that energy that is higher than the mid-range and the high end is going to trigger your compression, your limiting. It's going to be much harder to get that loud. And the shorter that you make your kick, the shorter that you make your bass, is ultimately giving you headroom. Because even though the energy is the same, it's for a shorter amount of time, which is letting everything else breathe. Now, again, if you've got a long kick and you've got a long bass, add the two of them together. Even though I'm ducking the bass and side chaining from the kick using Fuser, again, those two are still adding up at certain points in regards to their sustain. Because there might be a point where, again, the sidechain ducking is really fast with Fuser, but there might be an overlap where both sustain meet, and then all of a sudden you've got this low-end energy that's then going to trigger your compression, blah, 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 blah. If you want another example of this, I feel terrible for doing this, but it's a track that every time I listen to it, I'm just like, oh my God, like I can't unhear it. It's a song called Cocoon from Catfish and the Bottlemen. I don't know who mixed it. I don't really care. But that's a very, very good example of how a bass hasn't been well controlled, and the low end of that bass drowns out the entire track. And it's the reason why when it gets to the chorus, they can't really get it loud. Basically, the chorus just kind of chokes a little bit. And the vocals and the guitars. Now, this is an indie band where the guitars are very, very important. It's an indie band. And obviously the vocal as well. But the guitars are important, and the guitars are just fighting at getting this boom, 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 boom. That's the way the whole kind of mix goes. And the whole mix and the limiting and everything is fighting. Because when I was speaking to Emra and I was talking to him about it today, he was like, Paulie, man, of course it's important. That's why I told you about the importance of deboom. But he was also like, Paul, if I get a track to master and, the bass sustain is all over the shop, he went, Paul, I can't really fix it. There's nothing I could do about that. It's in the fucking mix, Paul. I would need to go back to the mixer and say, you need to shorten the wavelength of the bass. But if it's been accepted by the client, then it gets a bit difficult. And when it comes to session players, you know, that's why they're paid the big bucks, because they understand their playing and they understand the feel. They understand how to control their instrument. So a lot of these big mixers are normally getting bass that's very, very well controlled, because in a sense, that is the producer's job. I don't think it's the mixer's job. I would say it's the producer's job to manage the performance, to manage the low end. And normally, you know, it might just be a thing where the mixer listens to it, and in the context of the mix, they might just feel, right, maybe just get a transient designer on there and we'll just kind of maybe like shave that sustain off just a little bit. Where obviously in like more acoustic stuff, if you're dealing with bands and, you know, artists that are maybe like recording in their house and stuff like that, or again, they're not a session bass player, the playing might be all over the shop. And again, when you add compression to your low end, it's only going to further enhance the sustain. So you've got to control that, because if you don't control it, as we heard in that in the mix that I sent to the client, which I'm still annoyed about, but either way, I've sent him the next mix, which I know he'll accept that. I don't think he's going to accept mix 1. I think he'll accept mix 2. But yeah, it's very, 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 very important, and hopefully you can understand now why, if you don't control and maintain the sustain of your low end, you'll never get the mix that you're after. You'll never be able to compete with the pros. Like if you listen to Cocoon by Catfish and the Bottlemen, and then you listen to, say, Borders by Sam Fender, the bass is fucking super, super tight. And then if you listen to, say, Late Night Talking by Harry Styles, Spike Stent has got that bass so tight within an inch of its life. The bass is genuinely just an extension of almost like the kick. It's so, so, so super tight. But it's also the reason why his mid-range is so open and it blossoms out. Hopefully this has been an educational video for you. If you have learned something from this today, consider dropping a super thanks, or just like the video. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. My name is Paul Third, and I will see you, hopefully, when I'm not ruining my clients' mixes with too much bass.